The Concord Arena was the largest structure ever built by any species in the known galaxy, and it floated in the cold silence of space above a world called Valhari Prime, like a crown made of steel and light. Every 4 cycles, the arena came alive with the sound of 100 different languages, the stomping of 1,000 different feet, and the roaring of crowds that stretched across dozens of relay screens all the way to the far edges of civilized space. This was the Galactic Kinetic Trials, the most watched, most celebrated, and most brutal athletic competition in existence. Winning here did not just bring glory to an athlete, it brought power to an entire species. The species that dominated the trials earned higher placement on the Galactic Prestige Index, and that index decided everything. Trade agreements, territorial respect, military alliances, and the quiet, unspoken hierarchy that governed who mattered in the galaxy and who did not. Rael Torvund stood behind a curved glass wall overlooking the massive central staging ground where athletes from over 80 species were gathering, stretching, growling, clicking, and preparing for what would be the most intense week of competition in recent memory. Rael was a Velthari, tall, thin, with silver-blue skin and 4 narrow eyes that could read a data tablet from across a room without squinting. He was the chief organizer of this cycle's trials, and he had spent 3 full years planning every detail, every course, every safety net, every broadcast angle. He held a glowing data pad in his long fingers and scrolled through the competitor roster one more time, checking for last-minute withdrawals or additions. Most of the names were familiar. The Gorvathi Empire had sent their strongest warriors as always, led by the legendary Drukal, a 6-limbed reptilian giant who had won the ice event for the last 3 consecutive cycles and showed no signs of slowing down. Slowing down. The Ilnari Collective had entered a squad of razor-fast insectoids with 4 arms each, and reaction speeds that made other species look like they were moving through mud. The Drethkai Sovereignty had sent their finest aquatic predators, sleek, scaled, and graceful in any fluid environment. All expected, all powerful, all dangerous. Then Rael's 4 eyes narrowed at a new entry near the bottom of the list. Terrans, species 4471, Earth Union, first-time participants. He blinked twice and read it again. Terrans, the soft-skinned, 2-armed, 2-legged creatures from the wet little world orbiting a yellow star at the far edge of the spiral arm. They had only been admitted to the galactic community 3 cycles ago, and in that short time they had done nothing particularly impressive, at least not in the eyes of most galactic citizens. Their ships were slow, their technology was decades behind, and their biology was, by comparison, unspectacular. Every known metric, completely unremarkable. No claws, no scales, no venom, no natural armor, no magnetic bones, no bioelectric field, no regeneration. Just soft skin, fragile bones, and an oddly high water content. Rael exhaled through his thin nostrils and shook his head. Why would they even bother entering? Down on the staging ground, Corporal Jenna Morrow stood among the gathered athletes and tried very hard not to feel small. She was 5 feet 7 inches tall, which was average for a human woman, but laughably tiny compared to almost every other competitor in sight. To her left, a Gorvathi warrior was stretching all 6 of his massive arms, each one thicker than Jenna's entire torso, his dark green scales catching the overhead lights like polished stone. To her right, an Ilnari athlete was doing some kind of rapid clicking warm-up with her mandibles, while her 4 arms moved in 4 completely different stretching patterns. Once, behind her, a Drethkai competitor slithered past on a film of moisture that his body produced naturally, his tail swishing in a way that looked almost lazy, but carried enough force to shatter a concrete wall. Jenna took a slow breath and adjusted the collar of her Earth Union uniform, a simple dark blue jumpsuit with the planet emblem stitched on the shoulder. She was not a diplomat, or a scientist, or a soldier in the traditional sense. She was a former Winter Olympics skeleton racer, who had been recruited by the Earth Union Liaison Office specifically for this event. When the invitation to the Galactic Kinetic Trials had arrived on Earth 6 months ago, the Union had scrambled to find someone, anyone who might not embarrass the entire species on a galactic stage. Jenna had been chosen not because she was the strongest or the fastest human alive, but because the final and most prestigious event of the trials was something that the selection committee believed gave humanity a secret edge. The Shiver Skull, the legendary ice course. She had studied the files on the trip here. A kilometers-long track of pure glare ice carved through an asteroid fragment, featuring steep drops, hairpin turns, spiraling tunnels, and a zero-gravity ice cavern called the Frostmaw that had ended careers and broken bones across dozens of species for centuries. Competitors had to traverse the entire course using only their bodies and basic friction gear. No thrusters, no engines, no anti-gravity tech, no assistance of any kind. It was considered the ultimate test of physical control, balance, and kinetic mastery. And it was the one event that the Gorvathi had dominated without challenge for as long as anyone could remember. A deep, rumbling voice pulled Jenna from her thoughts. "You are the Terran," it said, not a question, but a statement delivered with the weight of absolute certainty. And up, into the face of Drukal himself. He was enormous, even by Gorvathi standards, nearly 9 feet tall, with 6 powerful limbs, a head crowned with ridged bone plates, and eyes the color of molten copper. His scales were dark green, with streaks of black along his jaw and neck, and every single one of them looked like it could stop a blade. He was looking down at her the way a mountain might look at a pebble, not with contempt, but with a kind of distant, respectful curiosity. "I am Drukal of the 7th Claw Legion," he said, his voice vibrating in Jenna's chest like a bass drum. "I have watched the files on your species. You have no claws for gripping, no armored body for impact, no limbs built for stability on frozen surfaces." Jenna nodded slowly. He was not wrong about any of that. "I do not say this to mock you," Drukal continued, and his tone carried something that sounded genuinely like concern. "I say this because the Shiver Skull is not kind to those who come unprepared. I have seen warriors twice your size shatter bones on the first drop alone. The ice does not forgive, Terran." Jenna looked up at him and smiled. A real warm smile that seemed to confuse him slightly. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate the warning. Really, I do." Drukal studied her for a long moment, his copper eyes narrowing just a fraction, and then he gave a slow, rumbling nod and turned away, his massive tail sweeping behind him like a battering ram wrapped in scales. He clearly believed she would not survive the course. Jenna watched him go, and then turned back toward the display screen that showed the full layout of the Shiver Skull in glowing blue lines. Every turn, every tunnel, every deadly drop, mapped out in perfect detail. She studied it the way she used to study the skeleton tracks back on Earth, reading the angles, feeling the weight shifts in her mind, imagining the ice beneath her body. Around her, the alien athletes were loud and confident, roaring and clicking and hissing their war cries. Jenna said nothing. She just smiled again, small and quiet, and kept studying the ice. The medical screening hall was a massive circular room deep inside the Concord Arena, lined with scanning pods that hummed and glowed with pale green light, as each competitor stepped inside for their mandatory biological evaluation. Every athlete who entered the Shiver Skull was required to undergo a full body scan, not just for health and safety, but so the Galactic Medical Board could log their species' physical data and assess their risk level on the course. It was standard procedure, and most competitors walked through it without a second thought. When the Gorvathi stepped into the pods, the scanners registered dense bone structure, layered muscle, reinforced tendons, and 6 limbs capable of generating tremendous grip force on any surface. The medical team marked them as low risk. When the Ilnari went through, the scanners picked up lightning-fast neural pathways, compound eyes with 360-degree vision, and an exoskeleton that could absorb and dissipate impact. Significant impact. The medical team marked them as moderate risk due to limited joint flexibility on ice. When the Drefkai were scanned, their bodies showed hydrodynamic perfection, smooth scales, flexible spines, powerful tails, but their friction coefficient on dry solid surfaces was almost zero, and the medical team marked them as high risk with a recommendation to withdraw. Then, Jenna Morrow stepped into the pod. The machine hummed, pulsed, and projected a full 3-dimensional image of her body onto the display screen in front of the 3 alien doctors who were assigned to evaluate her. They stared at it in silence for a long moment. Dr. Velsh, the lead examiner, a 4-eyed Velthari with a reputation for being thorough, tilted his narrow head and tapped his datapad with one long finger. "Interesting," he murmured. Her skeletal structure was light, far lighter than most species competing in the trials, with thin bones that the scanner flagged as potentially fragile under high-impact conditions. Her muscle density was moderate at best, concentrated in her legs and core, rather than spread evenly across her frame. Her skin had no protective layer, no scales, no chitin, no dermal plating of any kind, just soft tissue that would bruise, cut, and tear on contact with hard ice. But there were a few readings that made Dr. Velsh pause. Her center of gravity was unusually low for a bipedal species, sitting just below her hips rather than in her chest, the way it did for most upright walkers in the galaxy. Her joints, particularly in her ankles, knees, and hips, showed a range of motion that the scanner labeled as excessive and flagged as a potential injury risk. Her feet were strange, arched in the middle with dozens of small bones and tendons that seemed to allow for constant micro-adjustments in balance and weight distribution. And her skin produced a thin, natural layer of oils that reduced surface friction ever so slightly. The second doctor, a broad-shouldered Krellian with stone-gray skin, leaned over and looked at the display with visible confusion. "What is the advantage here?" he asked. "I see no claws, no grip structures, no magnetic alignment in the bone matrix. How does this species even walk on flat ground without falling over?" Dr. Velsh shook his head slowly and made a note on his pad. "High risk, recommend withdrawal." He called Jenna over and explained the results to her in a calm, professional tone that carried a thin layer of pity beneath it. "Your biology is not suited for this kind of surface," he told her. "Your body has no natural tools for maintaining stability on ice. I would strongly advise you to consider withdrawing from the Shiverskull before the event begins." Jenna listened politely, nodded, and then said, "I appreciate the concern, Doctor," blinked all 4 of his eyes at once, and then shrugged. It was not his job to force anyone to withdraw, only to advise. He waved her out, and she walked back into the preparation hall with her medical clearance stamped and her risk level marked in bright red, the highest danger category the board could assign without requiring mandatory removal. In the preparation chambers, the atmosphere was tense and electric. Each species had its own section of the hall, and every team was busy outfitting their athletes with the best friction gear that galactic technology could provide. The Gorvathi were sharpening their claws on special grinding stones that honed the edges to microscopic points, designed to dig into ice like pickaxes with every step. Their gear included reinforced boots with retractable claw extensions made from a synthetic alloy harder than diamond, and their chest plates were fitted with stabilization gyroscopes to keep their massive bodies upright on slippery terrain. The Ilnari were applying chemical friction sprays to their exoskeletons, a sticky compound that was supposed to increase their grip on smooth surfaces by 300%. Their 4 arms were fitted with small balance rods that could extend and retract to help them recover from sudden slips. The Dreth Kai, despite their high-risk rating, had refused to withdraw. They had brought custom-built friction pads that attached to their smooth bellies and tails, covered in thousands of tiny synthetic hooks, designed to catch on microscopic cracks in the ice surface. Every team was treating the ice as what they believed it was, a hostile, dangerous surface that required advanced technology and clever engineering to survive. Jenna sat on a bench in the small, quiet section that had been assigned to the Earth Union delegation, which consisted of exactly 4 people: Jenna herself, her coach Marcus Webb, and a communications officer named Priya Desai, and a nervous young intern named Tomas Reyes, who had been tasked with carrying the Earth Union flag. Marcus sat down next to her and handed her a cup of water. "You saw the medical report?" Jenna asked. "I saw it," Marcus replied with a grin. "High risk. They think you're going to die out there." "They think I cannot even walk on ice without falling," Jenna said, and there was something in her voice that was not anger or frustration, but quiet amusement. The kind of amusement that comes from knowing something that everyone else in the room has missed. Marcus leaned back and crossed his arms. "They have no idea, do they?" "None," Jenna said. And she was right. They had no idea at all. Because everything the alien doctors had flagged as a weakness was, in the context of ice, a strength. Her low center of gravity meant she could stay balanced on slippery surfaces where top-heavy species would topple. She could absorb sudden shifts and adjust her body in real time without locking up. Her arched feet, with their dozens of tiny bones, were not a design flaw. They were a masterpiece of evolutionary engineering that allowed humans to make hundreds of micro-balance corrections per second without even thinking about it. And her light frame, which the scanners had dismissed as fragile, meant she could glide across ice with almost no resistance, while heavier species would grind to a halt or crack the surface beneath them. None of the aliens understood this, because none of them came from a world like Earth. Most habitable planets in the galaxy were warm, orbiting close to their stars, blanketed in thick atmospheres, covered in oceans and jungles and deserts, but almost never in frozen water. Ice, to the vast majority of galactic species, was a rare and exotic substance, something they encountered in laboratories or on the occasional frozen moon. Of their home worlds, Earth was different. Earth was a world where frozen water covered enormous regions of the planet for months at a time, where entire continents disappeared under sheets of ice during the long ages that humans called the Ice Ages. Humans had not just survived those frozen millennia, they had adapted to them. They had learned to walk on ice, run on ice, hunt on ice, fight on ice, and eventually, when survival was no longer the only concern, they had learned to play on ice. They had invented skating, and skiing, and sledding. They had built entire sports around frozen surfaces: hockey, curling, figure skating, speed skating, luge, bobsled, and skeleton racing. They had carved tracks out of mountains and slid down them at terrifying speeds for no reason other than the pure joy of it. Ice was not humanity's enemy. It was humanity's oldest playground. Jenna opened her gear bag and pulled out her equipment for the Shiver Skull. It was almost embarrassingly simple, compared to what the other teams had brought. A thin, aerodynamic bodysuit designed to reduce wind resistance, a pair of modified skeleton boots with minimal grip on the soles, lightweight gloves with textured fingertips, and a sleek helmet with a clear visor. No claw extensions, no friction sprays, no gyroscopic stabilizers, no synthetic hooks. Marcus looked at the tiny pile of gear and then looked at the towering racks of alien equipment visible across the hall, and let out a low whistle. "They are going to laugh at us," he said. Jenna pulled on her gloves and flexed her fingers. "Let them laugh," she said quietly. "They will not be laughing at the finish line." Outside the preparation chambers, the massive display screens that lined the Concord Arena's corridors were already showing previews of the Shiverskull course. The gleaming ice, the sharp turns, the terrifying drops, the spiraling tunnels. That disappeared into darkness. The odds boards had been posted, and the betting markets were already active. Drukal of the Gorvathi was the overwhelming favorite at 2-1. The Ilnari team captain was listed at 8-1. The Drethkai champion was at 15-1. And at the very bottom of the board, almost invisible, was a single line that read, Jenna Morrow, Terran, Earth Union, 500-1. The starting line of the Shiverskull was a wide platform of polished ice that stretched across the mouth of the course like the edge of a frozen cliff, and 96 competitors stood upon it in rows of 8. Their breath visible in the freezing air, their bodies tense, their eyes locked on the track ahead. The course itself was a terrifying thing to look at. It began with a long, straight stretch of glare ice, perfectly smooth, perfectly flat, and so slick that even standing on it without sliding required effort. Beyond the straight, the track curved sharply to the left and dropped into a steep downhill section that fell away at a 30-degree angle for nearly half a kilometer before leveling out into a series of tight, winding turns that snaked through walls of jagged frozen rock. After the turns came the mid-course, a broad, open expanse of rough ice, with uneven ridges and hidden cracks that could catch a foot or a claw and send a body tumbling at. And beyond the mid-course, barely visible in the distance, was the entrance to the Frostmaw, the final section, the section that broke champions. But that was a problem for later. Right now, the 96 athletes were focused on surviving the first 100 meters. The crowd noise was deafening, even through the thick walls of the enclosed course. Millions of spectators packed into the Concord Arena's viewing galleries, millions more watching on relay screens across the galaxy, all of them buzzing with anticipation for the event that many considered the highlight of the entire trials. The broadcast commentators, a pair of Velthari analysts named Sorath and Keel, were running through the favorites one last time for the audience. The Gorvathi are looking dominant as always, Sorath said, his voice smooth and practiced. Drukal is in the front row, third position from the left. He has won this event 3 times in a row, and shows absolutely no sign of weakness. His team has spent months perfecting their claw grip technique, and I expect him to take the lead early and hold it. The Ilnari are an interesting threat this cycle, Keel added. Their reaction speed is unmatched, and they have invested heavily in chemical friction technology. If anyone can challenge the Gorvathi on the turns, it is them. And what about the Terran? Sorath asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. Keel paused for a moment, and then let out a soft laugh. The Terran is a curiosity. Species 4471, first-time entry, 500-1 odds. I expect she will be eliminated in the first section, but it is nice to see new species trying, I suppose. Down on the ice, Jenna Morrow stood in the back row, 8th position from the right, surrounded by competitors who towered over her on every side. She had pulled her visor down, and her body was still, perfectly, unnervingly still, in a way that stood out against the nervous shifting and fidgeting of the athletes around her. She was not stretching, not bouncing, not sharpening anything or spraying anything or activating any device. She was just standing there, breathing slowly, her eyes fixed on the ice ahead of her, like a hawk watching a field from a great height. The starting signal was a deep, resonating horn blast that shook the air and vibrated through the ice beneath their feet. The moment it sounded, chaos erupted. 96 athletes surged forward onto the glare ice, and within the first 10 seconds, the field began to separate in ways that the commentators had not expected. The Gorvathi were the strongest off the line. Drukal and his teammates drove their sharpened claws into the ice with tremendous force, gouging deep grooves with every step, hauling their massive bodies forward through sheer brute strength. It was effective, but it was loud, and violent, and slow. Each step required them to stab, grip, pull, and release, and the ice screamed beneath their claws like metal being torn apart. They moved at a steady, powerful pace, but they were not fast. The Ilnari were faster off the start. Their forelegs moved in a rapid clicking rhythm, and their chemical friction spray gave them a decent grip on the flat section. But within 30 meters, something went wrong. The spray was designed for smooth surfaces, but the glare ice had a micro-texture that the spray could not fully bond with. And as the Ilnari picked up speed, their legs began to slip. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, stuttering skids that disrupted their perfect rhythm. An insectoid body is built for precision. Every movement is calculated, timed, synchronized, and when the ice broke that rhythm even slightly, the entire system began to fail. One Ilnari athlete's front left leg slipped 2 centimeters to the side, which caused her rear right leg to compensate, which threw off her front right leg, which sent her into a spiraling stumble that ended with all 4 legs locked at wrong angles as she crashed onto her side and slid helplessly into the barrier wall. 3 more Ilnari went down in the next 20 meters in nearly identical fashion. Their exoskeletons had no flex, no ability to absorb and adapt to the unpredictable microshifts that ice demanded, and once their balance broke, they had no way to recover. The crowd gasped, and the commentators scrambled to adjust their predictions. The Drethkai fared even worse. They were magnificent in water. Their bodies were designed for fluid motion, for gliding through currents with effortless grace, but ice was not water. Ice looks smooth the way water looks smooth, but it behaved completely differently. It had no current to push against, no resistance to lean into, no buoyancy to support a body in motion. The Drethkai hit the glare ice and immediately began to spin. Smooth, frictionless scales, which made them gods in the ocean, turned them into helpless, rotating disasters on the frozen surface. One Drethkai athlete tried to use his tail as a rudder, the way he would in water, and only succeeded in whipping himself into a full 360-degree spin that sent him careening off the track entirely. Another tried to dig her belly pads into the ice for traction, but the synthetic hooks caught unevenly and flipped her onto her back, where she slid backward down the track like a living sled with no driver. Within the first 100 meters, nearly a third of the field had been eliminated or reduced to a crawling, slipping, stumbling mess. And then there was Jenna. She had not rushed off the start line the way the others had. She had taken 3 quick, short steps to build a base of momentum, and then dropped her body low, bending her knees deeply and shifting her weight forward over her toes. It was not running. It was something the alien spectators had never seen before. Her feet moved in smooth, alternating pushes against the ice, each one angled precisely to convert lateral force into forward motion, and between pushes, she simply slid, her body low, her arms tucked, her weight perfectly centered over her feet. She was skating. Not with skates. She had no blades on her boots, no special equipment, nothing but the thin soles of her modified shoes and a lifetime of understanding how human bodies interact with frozen surfaces. She read the ice the way a sailor reads the wind, instinctively, naturally, without conscious thought. When the surface was smooth, she glided and let friction do the work of slowing her just enough to maintain control. When the surface was rough, she adjusted her foot angle by fractions of a degree and shifted her weight to compensate. When the track curved, she leaned into the turn and let centripetal force carry her around the bend instead of fighting it the way every other competitor was doing. She passed the first group of fallen Ilnari without slowing down. She swept past a struggling Drethkai who was still spinning in slow circles near the edge of the track. She moved through the field like water flowing around stones, smooth, quiet, and impossibly fast. The commentators did not notice her at first. They were too busy covering the drama at the front of the pack, where Drukal was grinding his way into the lead with raw power. But then Sorat's voice cut off mid-sentence. "Wait," he said. "What is, Keel, are you seeing this?" The cameras swung to find the small figure in the dark blue suit moving through the middle of the pack at a speed that should not have been possible for someone without claws, friction gear, or any visible means of propulsion. "That is the Terran," Keel said, and for the first time in the broadcast, his professional composure cracked. How is she moving like that?" Jenna hit the steep downhill section and did something that made the entire arena fall silent. She did not slow down. She did not dig in or grab for the walls, or try to control her descent the way every other competitor was doing. Instead, she dropped her entire body flat against the ice, face down, arms pressed to her sides, chin tucked, legs straight, and she let gravity take her. She rocketed down the slope like a missile, accelerating to a speed that the tracking sensors clocked at over 120 kilometers per hour. Her body perfectly aligned with the surface, her subtle weight shifts steering her path with surgical precision. She was running the skeleton, not on a sled, on her own body, using the same techniques she had trained for years on the frozen tracks of Earth, reading the ice beneath her through the vibrations in her chest and the pressure on her chin and the rushing wind against her visor. She hit the bottom of the slope and transitioned into the winding turns without losing a single fraction of her speed, leaning left and right with a fluidity that looked like it had been choreographed by the ice itself. Behind her, the Gorvathi were still grinding down the slope, their claws tearing trenches in the surface. The gap was already enormous. The commentators had stopped speaking entirely. The crowd had gone quiet, and somewhere in the viewing gallery, Commander Rael Torvund set down his datapad and stared at the screen with all four of his eyes wide open, because what he was watching was not supposed to be possible. Not for a species ranked as a mid-tier predator with no special physical traits. But there she was, sliding through the ice course like she had been born on it. And in a way, she had been. The mid-course was a wide-open expanse of rough, uneven ice, cracked and ridged and treacherous, in ways that the smooth glare ice of the opening section had not been. And it was here that the race truly began to separate the survivors from the fallen. Of the 96 competitors who had started the Shiver Skull, only 41 were still moving forward by the time they reached this section. The rest had been eliminated by crashes, slides into barrier walls, complete loss of traction, or voluntary withdrawal after realizing that their bodies simply could not handle what the ice was demanding of them. Drukal was still in the lead, barely. The massive Gorvathi champion had powered his way through the downhill section and the winding turns through sheer force and willpower, his 6 claws tearing into the ice with every step, his enormous body hunched low against the frozen surface, like a siege engine grinding its way across a battlefield. Was costing him. His breathing was heavy and labored, and his muscles burned with the strain of fighting for every single meter of progress. Ice was not a surface that rewarded strength. It rewarded something else entirely, something that Drukal did not have a word for in his language, because his species had never needed to describe it. Behind him, a handful of other competitors were still in the race. 2 Ilnari, who had survived the opening section by sheer luck, and were now moving with careful, terrified precision. A single Drethkai, who had abandoned all dignity, and was crawling on her belly using her friction pads to inch forward. And a Krellian, whose stone-heavy body gave him enough raw weight to stay planted on the ice, even if it made him agonizingly slow. And then there was Jenna, who had closed the gap between the back of the pack and the front so quickly that the tracking system had to recalibrate twice to confirm her position. Rough ice, with adjustments so small and so fast that the cameras could barely capture them. A tiny shift of her ankle here, a micro-bend of her knee there, a subtle rotation of her hip that redirected her momentum around a crack in the surface, that would have tripped any other athlete. She was not thinking about these adjustments. They were happening below the level of conscious thought, driven by a nervous system that had been shaped by millions of years of evolution, on a world where frozen ground was a fact of life. Her ancestors had crossed glaciers, hunted on frozen lakes, navigated ice-covered mountains, and survived winters that lasted half a year, and every one of those experiences had been encoded into the reflexes and instincts that were now carrying her across the Shiver Skull, like she was taking a walk through a park. She reached the edge of the mid-course and saw the entrance to the Frostmaw ahead, a gaping tunnel of pure blue ice that plunged downward into the hollowed-out core of the asteroid fragment, spiraling and twisting into darkness. This was the section that ended careers. This was where the Shiver Skull earned its reputation as the most dangerous event in the galactic kinetic trials. The Frostmaw was divided into 3 stages: the drop, the spiral, and the cavern, and each one was designed to test a completely different aspect of physical control on ice. The drop came first, a near-vertical chute of polished ice that plunged straight down for over 200 meters before curving sharply into the spiral. Drukal reached the drop ahead of Jenna and hesitated at the edge for a long, visible moment. He looked down into the gleaming blue shaft, and his copper eyes widened just slightly. Not with fear exactly, but with the hard recognition of a warrior who knows he is about to enter a fight that he may not win. He drove his claws into the edge of the chute and began to lower himself in, climbing down the vertical ice wall like a massive lizard descending a frozen cliff. His 6 limbs spread wide, his claws screaming against the surface as they carved deep gouges to hold his weight. It was controlled, it was methodical, and it was painfully slow. Behind him, the 2 surviving Ilnari reached the drop and froze, their compound eyes taking in the vertical shaft, their mandibles clicking in rapid, panicked communication with each other. One of them tried to enter the chute feet first, gripping the edges with her chemical-sprayed legs. But the spray had worn thin over the course of the race, and her feet slipped immediately. She tumbled into the shaft with a shriek, and bounced off the walls 3 times, before the safety net at the bottom caught her and pulled her out of the race. The other Ilnari looked at the shaft, looked at the safety withdrawal button on her wrist, and pressed it without hesitation. The Krellian did not even attempt the drop. He took one look at the vertical ice, and sat down heavily on the edge, his stone face expressionless, and activated his withdrawal beacon. That left only a handful of competitors still in the Frostmaw. Drukal climbing slowly down the chute, the lone Drethkai crawling on her belly somewhere behind, 2 other competitors from species Jenna did not recognize, and Jenna herself. She reached the edge of the drop and looked down. 200 meters of vertical ice, smooth as glass, curving at the bottom into the entrance of the spiral. She took one breath, set her feet on the edge, leaned forward, and let go. She did not climb down, she slid. She entered the chute on her back, feet first, her body pressed flat against the ice wall, with her arms tight against her sides, and her head tilted just enough to see where she was going. Gravity took her instantly, and she accelerated, 40, 60, 80, 100 kilometers per hour, the ice blurring. Beneath her, the walls of the shaft rushing past in streaks of pale blue light. She controlled her descent with nothing but the pressure of her shoulders and the angle of her feet, pressing harder against the wall to slow down, releasing to speed up, tilting her body left or right to adjust her path as the chute curved beneath her. She shot past Drukal in a blur. The Gorvathi champion felt the rush of wind as she went by, and turned his massive head just in time to see her disappear around the curve at the bottom of the chute, at a speed he could not comprehend. He let out a sound, not a roar, not a curse, but something closer to a gasp, the sound of a warrior watching something that his entire understanding of combat and competition had not prepared him for. Jenna hit the curve at the bottom of the drop and rolled smoothly onto her stomach, transitioning from a backslide to a prone glide without losing speed, and entered the spiral. The spiral was a corkscrew tunnel of ice that twisted 7 full rotations around a central axis, each rotation tighter than the last, the walls smooth and curved, and completely devoid of anything to grip or push against. Species that relied on claws could not use them here. The walls were curved, and claws designed to dig into flat surfaces simply skidded off the rounded ice. Species that relied on friction gear found that the centrifugal force of the spiraling tunnel ripped them away from the walls and sent them tumbling through the rotations like loose cargo in a spinning ship. The spiral was a nightmare for almost every body type in the galaxy. For Jenna, it was a skeleton track. She entered the first rotation low and fast, her body pressed against the outer wall of the spiral, her weight shifting from her left hip to her right shoulder to her left hip again, in a rhythmic, rolling motion that kept her centered on the curve as it twisted around and around, corkscrewing, using the same technique that skeleton racers used on the twisted sections of their tracks back on Earth, reading the curve through the pressure on her body and adjusting her line with movements so subtle that they were almost invisible. She moved through the 7 rotations in less than 40 seconds, each one faster than the last, her body spinning with the tunnel rather than against it, working with the ice instead of fighting it. Behind her, Drukal entered the spiral and immediately ran into trouble. His massive frame was too wide for the tightest rotations, and his claws could not find purchase on the curved walls. He tried to brace himself with all 6 limbs spread against the tunnel walls, but the centrifugal force pulled him loose and sent him bouncing from wall to wall to wall, his armored scales cracking against the ice with sounds like gunshots, his roars of frustration echoing through the frozen tunnel. He made it through, barely, bleeding from half a dozen places where the ice had cracked his scales, his breathing ragged, his body trembling with pain and exhaustion. And then came the cavern. The final stage of the Frostmaw was a vast, hollowed-out chamber of ice deep inside the asteroid, and it was in 0 gravity. The artificial gravity that covered the rest of the course did not extend into the cavern. This was raw, open space, enclosed in walls of frozen water, with no up, no down, no floor, and no ceiling. The exit tunnel was on the far side of the chamber, nearly 300 meters away, across open, weightless space. There was nothing to walk on, nothing to swim through, nothing to push against, except the ice walls at the edges of the chamber. Every competitor who entered the cavern had to find a way to cross it using only the ice and their own body. Most could not. The Drethkai competitor, the last one still in the race, entered the cavern, and immediately began to float helplessly, her body spinning slowly in the weightless void, with no way to generate thrust or direction. She thrashed her tail, twisted her body, and grabbed at the empty air. But there was nothing. She was stranded, floating in the middle of a frozen void with no way to reach the other side. She pressed her withdrawal button, and was pulled out by the safety drones. Drukal entered the cavern, and used his claws to grip the ice wall, pulling himself along the surface, hand over hand, toward the exit. It was effective, but brutally slow, and every meter cost him more energy than he had left to give. Jenna entered the cavern, and did not stop. She hit the ice wall at the entrance with her feet, bent her knees to absorb her momentum, calculated the angle she needed in a fraction of a second, and pushed off. She launched herself across the weightless void like an arrow fired from a bow, her body straight, her arms pressed to her sides, trajectory aimed directly at the exit tunnel on the far side of the chamber. Halfway across, she realized her angle was slightly off. She was going to miss the exit by 2 meters to the left. Without panic, without hesitation, she tucked her knees to her chest and extended them again in a sharp, controlled kick that rotated her body just enough to shift her trajectory. A mid-air correction that used nothing but the conservation of angular momentum, and an understanding of physics that had been trained into her muscles on the practice tracks of Earth. She hit the far wall exactly at the edge of the exit tunnel, absorbed the impact with her arms, and pulled herself inside. The gap between her and Drukal was now 43 seconds. In a kinetic race, that was not just a lead. That was a different universe. The exit tunnel of the Frostmaw spat Jenna out onto the final stretch of the Shiver Skull, a long, wide corridor of ice that sloped gently downward toward the finish line, bathed in the bright white light of the arena's overhead lamps, and lined on both sides with transparent walls, through which the spectators in the viewing galleries could watch the competitors cross the end of the course. Jenna came out of the tunnel fast, faster than any competitor had ever exited the Frostmaw in the recorded history of the Galactic Kinetic Trials, and she let her speed carry her down the final slope without resistance, her body low, her arms tucked, her boots whispering against the ice in a smooth, continuous glide that looked less like racing and more like flying. The finish line was a glowing blue stripe that stretched across the full width of the track, and she crossed it at nearly 90 kilometers per hour, dropping into a clean, controlled slide stop that sent a wave of fine ice crystals spraying into the air like a cloud of frozen diamonds. She stood up, she took a breath, she rolled her shoulders, tilted her neck to one side and then to the other, and exhaled slowly, the way a person might after finishing a morning run through a park on a cool day. The arena was silent, not the kind of silence that comes from boredom or indifference. The kind of silence that comes when 100,000 people from dozens of different species all realize at the same moment that they have just witnessed something they do not have the ability to explain. It lasted 3 full seconds, and then the arena exploded. The sound hit like a physical force, a roaring, stomping, clicking, howling, hissing wall of noise that came from every direction at once, as the crowd erupted in a reaction that was part shock, part disbelief, and part pure, unfiltered awe. They had watched 96 competitors enter the Shiver Skull. Champions, genetic marvels from the most powerful species in the galaxy, and they had watched a small, soft-skinned, clawless, scaleless, two-legged creature from an obscure wet planet slide through the course like the ice itself was carrying her. The broadcast commentators were talking over each other in a scramble to describe what had just happened. "I have never, in 20 cycles of covering the trials, I have never seen anything like that," Sorath said, his usually smooth voice cracking with emotion. She did not fight the course. She did not even seem to struggle. It was as if the ice was not an obstacle for her at all, but I don't even have the word for it. "A partner," Keel said quietly. The ice was her partner. The tracking data flashed on the screens. Jenna Morrow, species 4471, Terran, Earth Union, finish time, 7 minutes, 14 seconds. Course record by a margin of 2 minutes and 38 seconds. The old record had been held by a Gorvathi champion from 12 cycles ago, and Jenna had not just broken it, she had shattered it so completely that the record board had to expand its display to fit the time difference. Nearly a full minute later, Drukal emerged from the Frostmaw exit tunnel. He was a wreck. His dark green scales were cracked and bleeding in a dozen places, smeared with streaks of pale blue where the ice had ground against his armor. 3 of his 6 limbs were shaking with exhaustion, and his breath came in heavy, rasping gasps that fogged the cold air around his massive head. He crossed the finish line a slow, grinding walk, not a sprint, not a charge, just the stubborn, relentless forward motion of a warrior who refused to stop moving until he physically could not take another step. When he stopped and looked up at the tracking screen to see his time and the gap between his finish and Jenna's, his copper eyes went wide. 43 seconds. 43 seconds to a creature half his size, with no claws, no armor, and no friction gear. He stood there for a long moment, breathing, bleeding, staring at the number on the screen as if he could change it by looking at it hard enough. Then he turned his head and found Jenna. She was standing near the edge of the finish area, her helmet off, her dark hair damp with sweat, talking quietly with her coach Marcus and smiling at something he had said. Drukal walked toward her. The crowd noise faded as the cameras followed the massive Gorvathi champion crossing the finish area toward the tiny human, and every spectator in the arena leaned forward to see what would happen. Jenna saw him coming and turned to face him, and for a moment they just looked at each other. The 9-foot reptilian warrior covered in blood and broken scales, and the 5'7" human woman in a plain blue suit who had just beaten him by nearly a minute on a course his species had dominated for generations. Drukal stopped in front of her and was silent for a long time. Then he lowered his massive head, bent all 6 of his legs, and exposed his throat. In Gorvathi culture, the throat bow was the highest sign of warrior respect that one fighter could offer another. It meant, I give you my life, because you have proven you could take it. And it was almost never performed outside of Gorvathi society, and never to a member of a species that the Gorvathi considered beneath them. The crowd went silent again. You did not fight the ice, Drukal said, his deep voice rough and quiet. You spoke to it, and it listened to you. He straightened up and looked down at her with those copper eyes, and what Jenna saw in them was not resentment or humiliation. It was the pure, honest admiration of a warrior who had found something greater than himself. I do not understand how you did what you did, he said, but I know what I saw, and what I saw was mastery. Jenna looked up at him and nodded, a simple, respectful nod, nothing more, and said, Thank you, Drukal. You ran a brave race. He let out a low rumble that might have been a laugh, and shook his enormous head. I did not run. I survived. You ran. In the hours that followed, the Concord Arena buzzed with a kind of energy that Commander Rael Torvan had never felt in all his years of organizing the trials. Every delegation wanted information about the Terrans, who they were, where they came from, how a species with no obvious physical advantages had just demolished the most feared ice course in the galaxy. The Galactic Science Board pulled up Earth's planetary file and began reviewing it with fresh eyes. And what they found there stunned them. Earth was not just a world with frozen water. It was a world that had been shaped by ice on a scale that most galactic species could not imagine. They read about the ice ages. Periods lasting tens of thousands of years when enormous sheets of frozen water covered entire continents and pushed every living thing on the planet to adapt or die. They read about the glaciers, the frozen oceans, the permafrost, the snow-covered mountains that humans had been climbing and skiing down for centuries. They read about the sports, the skating, the hockey, the skiing, the luge, the bobsled, the curling, the figure skating, dozens of activities that humans had invented for no strategic purpose whatsoever, purely because sliding on frozen water was something they found enjoyable. A Velthari analyst named Desra published a commentary that evening that spread across every news network in the galaxy within hours. It read, Most species in the Concord treat ice as an obstacle to be overcome, a hostile surface to be conquered with technology and brute force. Humans treat it as a tool. They slide on it for fun. They build sports around it. They carve it into art. They race across it at speeds that would terrify most sentient beings in the galaxy, and they do it laughing. That is not athleticism. That is something far more dangerous. It is mastery born from joy. The commentary hit a nerve across the galactic community because it pointed to something that the other species had never considered, that the most dangerous kind of skill is the kind that comes not from desperation or necessity, but from love. Humans had not learned to move on ice because they had to. They had learned because they wanted to. They had taken the most hostile surface their planet could offer them and turned it into a playground. And in doing so, they had developed an intuitive, bone-deep understanding of frozen physics that no amount of claw sharpening or friction spraying could ever replicate. The final scene came late that evening, when the celebrations had faded and the arena had grown quiet. Jenna sat alone in the Amazon observation deck at the top of the Concord Arena, looking out through the massive curved window at the ice moon that hung in the darkness below, a pale, frozen sphere glowing softly in the reflected light of a distant star. Her datapad buzzed in her hand, and she looked down at it. It was a message from Earth, from the Union Liaison Office, forwarded from dozens of different senders. Former Olympic skeleton racers, speed skaters, hockey players, figure skaters, bobsled teams, Nordic skiers, ice climbers, and polar researchers. All of them had watched the broadcast, and all of them were sending the same message in different words. "We saw what you did. We want in. Sign us up for the next cycle." Jenna smiled, a wide, real, unguarded smile, and looked back out at the ice moon. Somewhere down there, beneath that frozen surface, the ice was waiting, and thanks to a species that had spent its entire existence learning to dance on frozen water. The galaxy was about to find out just how deep humanity's love for the cold truly went. Jenna set down her datapad, leaned back in her chair, and whispered to the silence of the observation deck, "We are just getting started."